for this session, a bit of context for this session. I first did this webinar as really as a sales tool. It was people aren't going to come and buy and want to use Agendashift if they don't know what it is. So the idea of this webinar was to just try and introduce it, help people understand a little bit more about what it is, why they would want to use it, how it's different from some of the other things that are out there. And the focus, it really is outcome oriented and continuous transformation. That's the way I frame it. Actually, just in kind of refreshing myself on the slides this morning, I think I might even extend that to outcome oriented and continuous transformation at every scope and scale, just to bring in some of Mike's newer work as well. But I'll get to that eventually. So I'm assuming for this session, everybody here has much more familiarity with what Agendashift is than the initial intended audience. So I might skip over some slides or some things a little bit more quickly than I did then, and I'll not go into detail on some things that I think you already know. On the other hand, please jump in if I'm making assumptions and you want more detail about it, or maybe we can come back to that at the end. I kind of like to start with this little video. I don't know whether you've seen it before, but I'll play it and so give us some reactions. Let's use some of the Zoom reactions just to see how you're reacting to this. Hopefully that resonated with a few people. Certainly how I've experienced a lot of agile transformations, and I think there's a better way, and I think that's where Agendashift comes in. It's providing a better way of doing things rather than this solution first. We're going to install agile like we might install an operating system and put the floppy disks in, or download a package and hit exe. We need to start asking questions. So I really like and I'd like to start with the 3 questions that Mike has within Agendashift, which I think give us a better approach to how we approach change. So this first one, what if we put agreements on outcomes before solutions? To me, this is the focus on the outcome oriented. Let's start focusing on outcomes and orienting ourselves towards those outcomes rather than starting with solutions and imposing solutions. The second, how do we keep bringing outcomes to the foreground? This for me is the continuous bit of it. How do we keep doing this continuously? So again, a transformation isn't a one-off project that we transform and then they're done. We keep asking questions about what's happening, what's working, what's not working, where are the opportunities for change, where can we get better? So we're keeping bringing those outcomes to the foreground. Where have the outcomes shifted maybe and we need to change direction? And then the last bit, where and where else could we be developing and pursuing strategy? This is, I think, where that every scope and scale. So it's outcome oriented, it's continuous, and it's everywhere. So again, strategy and transformation isn't just driven by the top. Everybody should be engaged in it, and therefore we're kind of thinking of Agendashift as an engagement model. So I think these are really 3. I just love these 3 questions because they bring in all those 3 different aspects of being outcome oriented, being continuous, and also being everywhere, every scope and scale. So I'll probably, everybody knows what Agendashift is. So I think, but I like this as just a way of starting to talk about Agendashift, not just as a process or even a framework, but as a set of strategies in itself, as a set of patterns and as a set of principles. And then there's some exercises and techniques we can use with it, but really it's about the patterns, the principles, and the strategies behind it. But the other thing I like to focus on is actually agenda shift is a means to an end in itself. So actually, we want our businesses to be more successful. So these are 6 dimensions that I like to use. Slightly adapted. They come from Troy McGinnis's 6 dimensions, and he was influenced by Larry Mascheroni as well. But actually, when we start with a transformation, starting to think around what does success look like, and asking those questions first. Do we need to deliver more value? Do we want to be more productive as an organization? Do we want to be more predictable, more responsive? Do we need to increase quality? Do we need to be more sustainable? So those 6 things are all different. I think they pretty much cover every dimension that exists. And we can talk about, well, actually, what does value mean for your organization? What does productivity mean for your organization? Which ones are more important than others? And what are the trade-offs between them? So once you've got that starts leading into your outcomes, and starts leading you into starting with needs before we get into solutions. And that ties into strategy deployment. So one of the things I've been doing for the last 5-10 years is really kind of playing around with different ideas for strategy deployment. People that know me will know I talk about the X matrix, and I do have that on a slide towards the end of the presentation. But this is the way I describe strategy deployment: any form of organizational improvement in which solutions emerge from the people closest to the problem. And this is what I think Agenda Shift is helping us do. It's about organizational improvement, but we're not starting with a solution and then pushing that solution down onto people. We're starting with outcomes and needs. So actually, what are the problems we're trying to solve? And then we're assuming that the people closest to the problem, the people at the coalface, probably the people that are experiencing those problems are probably the people that have the most information and the best place to come up with some solutions and help us understand how can we fix those problems. So that's, this is really where I'm coming from, is Agenda Shift as a strategy deployment approach. And then when I'm working in the the lean and agile world, that ties into strategic agility, about agility being a strategic tool and something we use this for strategic advantage rather than just a set of processes and practices that we make our teams do. So when I think about Agenda Shift, then there's kind of 3 things, and I'm going to go through each of these 3 individually. But how is Agenda Shift different? What are some of the key things? The first one is about inviting, engaging people into the transformation, and these are almost kind of three parts of strategy deployment, you could say. So starting to invite and engage. First off, why is engagement important? I like to reference this paper by McKinsey, called the People Power of Transformations. They went and surveyed a bunch of people in transformations, and I think they asked 3 questions, something like, 1, have you been involved in a transformation? If you have been in a transformation, was that transformation successful? And then also, how engaged were you in that transformation? And what they found was there's a strong correlation between people that said their transformations were successful and how engaged they were in that transformation. So it's kind of a bit of difficult to read, but the key point is the 2 at the bottom with the dotted line, the line managers and frontline employees. So, those are the people that are probably closest to the problem. More of them reported successful transformations when they said they were engaged in transformation. So clearly engagement is key to being successful. How do we help engage people? So this is where Mike's True North exercise comes into it, the Agenda Shift True North, starting to think about everybody being able to work consistently at their ideal best. Again, I'll kind of skip through because I'll assume you're familiar, but getting people to think through, they're working their ideal best as individuals, teams, between teams, across and the organization beyond, working at their ideal best when they're having the right conversations, the right people at the best possible moment, working at their ideal best when their needs are being anticipated or needs are being anticipated and being met at just the right time. Getting people to think about that and articulate them is almost that first step in engaging them, because suddenly you're kind of going, your views, your experiences, your stories are important to us. So this True North starts engaging people, but also then engages people in setting direction. So actually, what does good like for people? We're not getting into solutions yet, but what does that ideal best look like? And then that naturally leads into the assessment. So again, I'm not going through the assessment in detail, but that's almost like that next level of detail of engaging people and starting to say, well, what are your experiences? You're the people close to the problems. What problems are you having in that sort of terminology? And then we can use the debrief tools and all the kind of various fancy graphics that Mike has to engage people in that conversation around, well, what's working, what's not working, where do we agree with each other, where do we have different experiences or different interpretations or different stories to tell. And this is all about, you know, inviting, engaging people and people feeling they're being listened to and people feeling that they're being involved. And I kind of make the point that, you know, this assessment is inclusive, so we can do it with everybody and anybody. It's non-prescriptive because it doesn't define anything, so it's framework agnostic as well. So it's not about how many stand-ups you do a week, how long are they, who turns up, you know, do you do retrospectives, etc. It's about outcomes themselves. So the assessment I find is one of those areas that kind of people really hook onto, and you know, just doing the assessment in themselves. And I found just doing the mini assessment with people, you don't really get anything out of the results of the mini assessment sometimes other than that initial engagement and people starting to kind of click as to, okay, I get it now, I can see how this can work, and yeah, I can see how a full engagement might be really powerful. And then obviously got a 15-minute photo as a way of engaging people. These are all about having conversations with people, generating, so that, you know, all these questions are generative questions, creating content, and all the information coming from the people that we're going to work with in the transformation, as opposed to somebody in a central team kind of going, right, I think I know what the problem is, and I think I have a solution. So kind of inviting, engaging people, I think is really key, really powerful part of this. Then the next bit is what I call acting in the present. So what do I mean by that? So we can talk about gap thinking. So gap thinking is kind of traditional, old school change management. Look at your current state, define an ideal future state, close the gap. So, you know, look at what your problems are now, kind of go, oh, if we just implement this solution as the ideal solution in the future, then that'll solve all our problems in the current state. What are the things we need to do to implement that ideal future state? So it's very much about thinking for the future, rather than using that ideal future as a direction setter. So actually, one of the things I make a distinction is between ideal and idealized. So if we think of that idealized future state, it's about moving towards a future state rather than treating the future state as a fixed destination. So that's where present thinking comes into it. And this language and some of the visuals come from Jay Bloom. Working in the present. So looking at the current state, and instead of saying what does the ideal future look like, saying what does the ideal current state look like? What does a better version of today look like, and what can we do just to make today better? Move to that ideal future state, then that ideal future state naturally becomes the new current state, and then you repeat the process until you get to another ideal current state, which may be good enough, or, you know, maybe we have sufficiently solved those problems. That new ideal current state, you know, may be the same as that ideal future state, or it may be somewhere different. So you have this now kind of range of flexibility for where you're going by taking it one step at a time. So I think the idea of kind of working in the present rather than kind of trying to work to the future is a really powerful one. And most transformations take a gap thinking approach. So I think Agendashift helps with this, with the 5W exercise. Again, I'll kind of skip through this, but again, the 5W for me is then more about an idealized future rather than ideal future. So this exercise gets people thinking about the future. What would the future look like? What might be achieved? Who would be involved in those things? But it doesn't define a solution. So that's more about an ideal, and the difference between idealized and ideal kind of comes from Russell Ackoff. Idealized design. There's another really good kind of source and reference to go and look at. But it's that idea that, probably the idealized, because it's idealized, it's probably not necessarily going to be achievable. but it gives you that sense of direction. So that is treating outcome oriented again. So outcome oriented, I think, can get taken two ways sometimes, or the word outcomes can get taken two ways. A lot of people treat, if I kind of go back to here, they say, well, my ideal future state is an outcome. So by defining an ideal future state, I'm still being outcome oriented. I think when we're talking about outcome oriented with Agendashift, we're more talking about impact and less about implementation. So that's the distinction I make. When you're taking this present thinking, it's more about, are you having an impact? Is the changes to your current state having a positive impact on the current state? And therefore, do you want to keep them and they become the new current state? So 5 Ws is really about what impact do we want to have in the future, not about what do we want to implement in the future. And then you got the I-do pattern. So again, that, what's the ideal? The ideal, and maybe it should be idealized obstacles, outcomes, if I'm being pedantic. But again, what's that compelling future? What's the impact we want to have in the future? But the obstacles bit of that is key here, because the obstacles start getting you to think about the present. What's in the way today? What are the obstacles we could remove today to make today better? So when we're getting into that outcomes for this, those outcomes are those a better current state rather than an ideal future state. So I think the ideal obstacles outcomes plays towards that idealized future concept and not into kind of the ideal implementation concept. So nice little pattern, and you'll know that this plays into the 5 Ws is an example of this, where you're kind of getting into the idealized future. The assessment and the surveys are all about kind of getting people to think about ideals and starting to dig into the obstacles as well, and then what are those short-term outcomes which are going to help. And then you've got these kind of the specific questions again. Kind of talk about generative questions here. I just love the way that Agendashift includes all these really powerful questions, including the clean questions in 15-minute photo, because the generative questions get people thinking, and then that gets people engaged and get people involved in them. So again, asking the questions about the ideal, asking the questions about the obstacles, what stops that gets in the way, and then asking questions about those outcomes. What would we like to have happen? What would make today better? And then what happens? And then what happens becomes those next steps as you move through that present thinking process. So the last piece of this is running experiments. So why run experiments? Because we learn from failure. So I'm not sure if people have seen this. I picked this up from Don Reinert's on information theory. If your probability of failure is 0%, it means you know everything, you have all the answers, you're never going to fail. But that means you're not going to learn anything, so you're not getting any new information. If you already know anything, there's no new information to be had. Equally, if you're failing 100% of the time, your probability of failure is 100%. Again, you're not really learning anything. You're not getting any new information. The sweet spot in the middle is around about a 50% probability of failure, because you're taking that information from failure, using that information, and they're hopefully failing less, not failing, being more successful the next time. So there's this sweet spot here. If we never fail, and most organizations are in that like we never want to fail mentality, it means you're not learning anything. It means you know everything. Now, this is contextual. I always kind of say when I got on an airplane, I don't want the probability of failure to be 50%. I'd like the probability of failure to be to 0% when I got on an airplane, because I'm kind of hoping they've learned how to build an airplane and the pilot knows how to fly it. So hopefully on that flight, they're not really generating any new information. But most organizations, there's lots of learning to be had. We don't know how to solve these problems. We're doing things for the first time. We're reacting to changes in the market or competition, etc. So lots of learning to be had. So that's why we need to treat changes as experiments, so that we can learn from them, generate the new information. So this plays into the Agendashift model of meaning, measure, method. The meaning is the outcomes. So what does it mean for us to be successful? Then how are we going to measure it? And then you get into the method. So this is avoiding confirmation bias. Again, a lot of people naturally jump straight into the method. I know how to solve this problem. You get into the method, then you kind of go, well, I'm still going to need to measure it. If you're measuring a method that you've already decided on, all that measures are going to do is confirm your hypothesis. You're not going to get anything that disconfirms it or proves it wrong. Start with the meaning, the hypothesis behind it, then decide how you're going to measure it, then decide what the experiment's going to look like. So identify what you really want to explore, why that's important, then identify how you're going to know whether you have it. For that, signs of emergence, indicators of progress, and then use those to methods to apply solutions. So even, I see a lot of people, even when they kind of talk about running experiments, all they're doing is identifying something they want to do as a method, deciding that they're going to measure that and call that an experiment. They skip the meaning part completely and they put the method before measure. So I think, again, this is another really powerful concept, starting with the meaning, then measures, then method. And then you get into the experiments themselves. So this is a definition I kind of like to use for experiments. Small to learn about which improvements are technologically and operationally feasible, which ones aren't, from the many adjacent possibilities. So there's kind of quite a lot of in there. I'm trying to unpack it a bit. So one, small safe to fail tests. Kind of that language comes from Dave Snowden, Cognitive Edge, Knevin. We want them to be small experiments and safe to fail, because we're acknowledging that 50% of the time they probably will fail if we're generating maximum information. So when an experiment fails, we don't want it to kind of put livelihoods, the business, jobs at risk. We want to kind of get that learning quickly, so that if we learn that our hypothesis was wrong and the experiment fails, we can dampen it down and kind of shut it off and try something different quickly. The bit about technologically and operationally feasible is language that I take from Russell Ackoff in Idealized Design. He talked about anything you do with the idealized design, it should be possible. We're not just kind of coming up with hypotheses that are, technologically unfeasible. Like I'm going to invent something which gets me to Australia in a couple of minutes. That's just technologically unfeasible at the moment. In most transformations, the operational feasibility is the key one. It's like there's no point in introducing a change where the culture of the organization just isn't ready for it yet. So it needs to be something small, which is we can technically do and which we can operationally implement, which the organization is going to be able to absorb. And equally, identifying which ones aren't, because there's no point in investing in something that's not going to work. Similarly, I'd say something like if people are familiar with S-terrain mapping, again, something of Dave Snowden's latest tool, that kind of helps start to identify which ones are possible and which ones aren't. So Dave talks about in terms of energy gradients, which ones require a high energy gradient. There's just lots of energy to implement a change. Or which ones are going to take a long time, or both. There's no point in trying to implement a change which is going to require a lot of energy and a lot of time. And then the adjacent possibilities, again, is complexity language, and goes back to present thinking. There are lots of things we could do. Let's identify the ones we think are worth trying. So there's multiple stepping stones around us. Which one stepping stones are worth trying? Which ones do we think are going to be stable and move us in the right direction? And which stepping stones do we think are going to be booby-trapped or take us in the wrong direction? So again, I'm a big fan of A3s. This is an Agendashift talk, so I show the Agendashift A3 template. But as Mike said, you're not a good consultant unless you've got your own A3. And I do have 3 forms of A3s, so I'll just leave that there. So experiments. A key part of running experiments, but doing experiments intentionally, deliberately, which means starting with your meaning, then your measures. So those are three areas with Agendashift that kind of see the idea that we're inviting, engaging people into it to help start with outcomes. We are I've just forgotten what the second was. We're acting in the present. kind of, not trying to define a future state, but kind of really saying, taking small steps from where we are now, and then running experiments. So as we take those small steps, we figure out, we learn what's going to work and what's not, as we move, hopefully, in the right direction towards our idealized future. So I kind of just come back to those three questions. These are the three key things that are important. Agreeing on the outcomes, doing it continuously, doing it everywhere. So I promised I'd mention the next matrix. So this is my way of doing strategy deployment, but I think it kind of ties into Agendashift a lot, and so Agendashift helps generate a lot of content on this. And I'll kind of quickly talk through this. So first of all, we start off with a true north. So this is a slide I put together, or an image I put together, to try and show the order with which I generally work through the X matrix. So we start with the true north. So the true north is really that statement of orientation. What's our North Star? What's going to guide us? Some people talk about true north again as a destination. I think when people are guided by the North Star, they're not trying to get to the North Star. It's just telling us, are we heading in the right direction? So true north is kind of similar thing. Most people, when you're navigating by true north, you're not literally trying to get to the North Pole. You're just using that to kind of help you understand whether you're heading in the right direction. So you start with that, and then aspirations. Aspirations being results we want to achieve. So how do we know when we've got there? And I quite often talk about ambition alongside aspirations. What's the size of our ambition? And again, that's going to be very contextual to the business, but ultimately those are the outcomes we're trying to achieve. That's going to this is how we define success as a business. Then we can move on to our strategies, number 3. Again, Agendashift helps us come up with transformation strategies through all its exercises, and particularly once you're getting into option relationship mapping, the challenge mapping, all those kind of the mapping exercises help us start thinking in terms of what are the strategies we're going to take. We can then identify those strategies, and I describe those as guiding policies. So when we're deciding what to do, how do we make those decisions? How do we decide what we are going to do? And also, how are we going to decide what we're not going to do? If your strategies don't help you decide what to do, they're not strategies. They're just kind of buckets of things we want to do. Then I'll move on to these correlations. So number 4, this kind of grid down here on the X matrix helps you decide or have a conversation around how does each strategy help towards each aspiration. And we can talk about, there's a strong correlation there. We can see how, this strategy of, we want to focus on strategy of improving flow. How does the strategy of improving flow help us with our aspiration of, selling 10,000 more units? Well, if we're getting stuff to market quicker, then presumably we're going to be able to deliver value quicker. That's going to help us deliver more units. So there's, we can kind of go, is there a good correlation there? Or actually, if we've got a strategy around, moving to the cloud, how does the strategy of moving to the cloud help us sell more units? Well, maybe all we're doing is using a different technology. Maybe it's not going to. So we can have these conversations around, do our strategies correlate or contribute to our aspirations? And you can see there's a many to many in here. Just kind of say you don't have to have 5 aspirations. You don't have to have 5 strategies. Generally, just 5 is the point at which I really kind of go in. Actually, you've got too many now. My sweet spot is 3 strategies. Again, otherwise they just become buckets. So you do these correlations here. Then you move on to the evidence. So evidence is your measures. How are we going to know whether our strategy is working? But I think I describe evidence as leading measures rather than our aspirations, which are trailing measures. So what are the things that are going to tell us and indicate that we're making progress? Going from strategies to evidence is a bit like your strategies are your meaning, or your aspirations and your strategies are your meaning. Your evidence become your measures, and then your tactics, which get to in the end, become your method. So going from aspirations to strategies to evidence to tactics is kind of heavily aligned with the pattern of meaning, measure, method. So we come up with these leading metrics, and then again we can do correlations. How do we think? Can we articulate the correlation or the contribution of each piece of evidence, each measure here, through to each aspiration? Again, that's a really powerful conversation to have to make sure things are coherent. So you do those down here. Then we move on to tactics. What are we actually going to do? What methods are we going to use? What practices, what projects or initiatives? Basically, you know, what experiments, big experiments are we going to be running? So this is the coherent action we're going to take. And then we can just fill in the last two quadrants here. Again, how does each tactic correlate, contribute to its strategy? How does each tactic correlate, contribute to generating the evidence? Once you've been through and filled this thing in, you've got all the pieces of the puzzle visualized on one page, and you've had hopefully a good conversation to make sure that it's all coherent, all makes sense. Everybody, you know, is basically agreed on it. You then need to make sure that it just doesn't become a document that gets rolled out. So then there's the deployment aspect of it, of engaging people. I like to use back briefing for kind of implementing the tactics. So within these tactics, you're then going to run multiple experiments. Make sure that you've got cadences, dashboards in place so you can actually track the evidence. Have conversations around, are we getting the evidence where we are expecting to get? Are our tactics working? Are our strategies the right strategy? So you're kind of having a conversation where you're constantly reviewing that. Even your strategies are a hypothesis. Even your aspirations are a hypothesis. So everything is being tested, and ultimately your evidence and your aspirations and those measures are telling you whether you're doing the right thing, whether things that your transformation is having an impact or not. So just kind of close off with a little quote. Anybody? I've kind of just opened up my chat meeting here. Anybody know who this quote is from? No. Surely. Come on, Philippe, you must know this. It's Anna from Frozen 2. So sometimes known as the Frozen True. Again, this is, I'm not sure Dave Snowden came up with this, but he certainly helped popularize it, and I really like it. Just the idea of doing the next right thing. What's the next right step? So it kind of goes back to that present thinking idea. So for me, this is what Agendashift helps us with: doing the next right thing, taking the next step, making the next choice, and then seeing where you get to, and then just repeating and getting. And eventually, you'll get out of the cave, and hopefully you'll be successful as a business. So that's the slides. Hopefully, you got enough time for some questions, and I can see a few questions in the chat. Andrew,
we've got about a quarter of an hour.
Yeah. So shall I just start going through the couple of questions? Well, I've not read Philippe's yet. Andrew asked us an example. I do have an example. Let me share a link.
Actually, Karl, if you give me the links to that example, the templates, and to the A3s that you mentioned, I can include them in the email I'll send to everybody after.
Yeah. So if you go to, if I just flick back through the slides. Oh no, what's going on there? Have I stopped sharing accidentally?
You have stopped sharing.
You have?
I have. I didn't mean to do that. I go back to here. This link down the bottom, template. So eventagility.co.uk/templates will give you links to my version of the experiment template, the back briefing template, and the X matrix template as well. And then
I'll include that in the email. Cool.
And then I wonder if I can just quickly find. I'll just have a quickly see if I can find I did a blog post with an example. The challenge with examples, as most things, is that all of this is really contextual, and I kind of worry about examples being copied and just like, oh, I'm just going to use this X matrix, So there's a massive caveat with the examples, but I did put one together because it's a fairly common question as to how does
I've got one as well, and it's fortunately it was filled in by someone with the neatest handwriting ever, so that's quite good.
Okay.
That link with meaning, measure, method I really enjoyed. You put that in the blog post a few weeks ago as well. Yeah, I appreciated that.
Yes, so that's I mean, most of this stuff is on my blog somewhere. Thank you, Rohit. You found it. That's the one I was thinking of.
Mhm.
I was playing around with, so one of the things I've done on my blog is, I kind of stop sharing for a bit. I kind of gone through and I said, what for an agile transformation, what would some generic aspirations be? Or what sort of framework might you be used to identify your aspirations? And it's things like increasing value, maintaining value, reducing cost, avoiding cost. So there's kind of full buckets of value. And then I think there's some things I've played around with around strategy. So back in the Kanban days, I used to talk about flow, value, and potential as three strategies. I used to call them impacts, but arguably I could think about those strategies. So increasing flow, increasing value somehow, and increasing the potential of the organization. And I mean long-term potential, whether there might be just investing in your people, or the quality of your code base or something like that. But so I did a post around some generic strategies. There's a post about evidence, and I generally for evidence I fall back on Troy's work and those 6 dimensions. So I think those 6 dimensions provide some really useful ideas for what you might measure. And then tactics just become so contextual that it's kind of difficult to kind of go, here's the tactics you want to do, because at that point I think you're kind of missing the point. But so I was going to try and put all that into an X matrix, and it was so theoretical that I couldn't quite bring myself to do it.
A bit too meta.
It was a bit too meta, and I worried that it was it just was going to become another like my X matrix framework.
I learned the hard way not to use Agendashift as the case study when you're doing an Agendashift workshop. I think you were at a workshop where that happened.
Yes.
Always makes it harder. Yeah. So anyone else have a question? I've got a couple up my sleeve, but if anyone's got a burning question, then we've only got 12 minutes left. So now's your chance.
I've got, and I'm very happy to do this after the session. I've got some feedback, Karl, that I can share with you, but very happy to do it after the session if you want to stay on, or we can set up another call.
I don't mind.
I'll give it to us, Russ.
Well, it's not really a question; it's just feedback. So if people have got a question, I think that should take the priority.
Well, I've got a nice couple of hard ones for Karl. And the hard ones are the best, I think. So the one was about the failure slide and that inverted U curve thing.
Yeah.
And I have a background in investment banking and energy risk management and things like that. And I always think about those curves are interesting, but what's the economic value of it, or what's the economic cost of that failure? And it's one of these things I think, well, when I have a spare week to actually do the maths, I might do it one day. But I'm sort of wondering if you're aware of any work that's been done on how you choose an appropriate failure rate according to the cost of acquiring that learning. And there must be an optimization to be done there. And, perhaps the failure rate changes depending on how quickly or how expensive it is to acquire. Is that something you've thought about? Any work there that you're aware of?
It's something I've thought about, but I think, and it's probably something I talked to, or I've talked to Don about, Don Reinerson, or I've heard him talk about. But certainly, I'm pretty sure what Don would say. So I'm going to channel my inner Don. I think what Don would say is it's not about how precise you are. It's about just recognizing the shape of it, and that you need to be somewhere in the middle. So it's not about being precisely 50%. It's just that if you're in and around that middle section, you're in a better place than if you're at the extremes.
Yes.
And I find that that's sufficient. That's the only reason I use that model for.
Yeah. I mean, you can always move towards the middle until it hurts too much. It costs.
Yeah. And it's like, most of other Don's trade-off curves. It's not about the precise shape of the curve. It's about recognizing that there's a trade-off in there.
Yes. Yeah. That's what I like about Don. You start doing, I mean, I've done his workshop. You start with dollars, and then at the end of it, you're doing T-shirt sizes. So you do it the hard way just to properly get the understand the relationships between things, and then you do things a lot more crudely because life's too short most of the time.
And I think it is. It's like what's to go meta on your question, what's the investment of trying to figure out the calculation and the preciseness of it?
Behind
just kind of going, you know what? failure is actually not a bad thing. Maybe it
Yes.
would be okay if we figured out
Yes.
how we can do a few more safe to fail experiments.
Yeah. Good. I do have another one, but I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's got her hand up.
Hi, hi Carl. Thank you
Hi,
so
Sarah.
much for your presentation. And lovely to see you again. We were on the Agile circuit about 20 years ago, and I absolutely loved it. Did some stuff around Agile. It solved some real difficult development business problems for me back in the day in the early 2000s. And then I had kids and I had no time to kind of come out to London and be part of all those seminars. So it's nice to be back and talking about some of this stuff that I've been doing for years. My question to you is, so thank you for that. Some really interesting slides there. I love it. My question to you is, everything hangs off outcomes. How do you know you've got a good outcome? How can you make sure that that outcome has been thought through in the right way? Because if that is not a good outcome, and you've got all these things hanging off it, yeah, fail fast and all that kind of stuff, yeah, you've got to do that. But how can you make sure you facilitate that well, and that becomes, yeah, this is a good outcome, let's go for this?
So I guess you can't know. So again, an outcome is in itself a hypothesis. You think it's an outcome. So at that point, then how do you test your way towards that hypothesis? So again, acting in the present, taking some small steps. Are you moving in the right direction? Do you think you're, do you think the progress you're making is good progress? Do you think you're kind of still heading, is the place you want to go still a good place to go? But in terms of identifying in the first place, then it's just engaging as many people in the process as possible. So that, to me, that's where things like from a transformation perspective, the survey and going in and asking those questions and having the conversations and using a lot of the techniques, the Cynefin and Wardley mapping and Nestorian mapping. There's a bunch of stuff out there that you can use to just kind of engage it, and almost they give you some different ways of testing your outcome. So
Part of the answer, isn't it?
Lenses of looking at it. Sorry, Mike.
It's part of the answer. I mean, a good outcome is one that people are interested in engaging in and providing, finding some solutions for, and so on. And the question I was going to ask wasn't really a question. It was,
that's a good signal, isn't it?
Exactly.
That it is the right outcome.
Obstacles, outcomes, solutions in the plural. In fact, more than plural, plentiful, abundant. Words like that. And that thought was prompted by the gap thinking slide. The gap thinking is all about one unitary, monolithic thing that we're pursuing. But what we're doing here is so much more multidimensional than that. And you're giving the maximum number of people the maximum number of opportunities to find something where they can engage. And it's when you've got the relationships between things, what you still have there is a coherent framework for decision making. It is a strategy. But it's one with a lot of room for engagement, a lot of room for innovation that you don't have to program in from the beginning. So I was going to say obstacles, outcomes, solutions in the plural, plentiful, abundant, discuss. And I was going to throw that at you.
Yeah.
But if you want to take that, then do. Yeah.
Because it's almost like it doesn't matter whether it's a good outcome. It's just like, as you say, are people engaged and aligned to it? What's more important is taking that step, so acting in the present, and then you can go, well, have we made today better? If we've made today better, that's a good outcome. How do you decide what today better is? Well, you might need something to kind of to align and agree on, and that's your kind of longer term outcome. But ultimately, you're acting in the present. Have we made today better? Yes, we have. Okay, now let's try and make the new today even better still. And just, are we gradually making things better? Do we? Now, I guess at that point then it's like, how do you define better? So that then outcome is more about how do we define better than, so what's a positive impact rather than what's an implementation that we want to achieve.
So you can use outcomes as the basis for your governance as well as your solutionizing. It's and your because the evidence part of your X matrix speaks to that as well.
I'm going
Russ, you look like you're about to ask a question.
Well, no, I'm going to chuck this into the chat. I think because it's relevant to Sarah's question, and it's you know, I like Troy's aspirations, you know, and it's a good question is what are we trying to achieve if we're improving the business? The BAI have updated their domains of agility, and they now look like this. So it's slightly different. But again, you know, they're just nice outcomes and things that you're going to aim for. But it does, especially when you show your X matrix and points 5 and 6, there's been an awful lot of buzz around OKRs lately. Jeff Gotholt has just released his book on it with the most appalling email. I don't know if you've seen his marketing email. It basically says you're shit at OKRs. Interesting approach. Buy my book. Yeah.
For 99 out of 100 recipients, that's probably true as well. But
Well,
Yeah,
it
I was
probably
gonna
is
say,
true,
okay.
but it's not. Yeah. Anyway, it's not endearing.
Mm.
But there's a point there. Is OKRs, you know, measure what matters and all that. They're not always leading indicators. So sometimes you know there might be cases for that. So I'm just thinking when you do the 5 and 6, you definitely want to be nodding to OKRs to bring that crowd in, and just remember in their world, you know, there are all sorts of things that you might want.
Yeah, I did do a blog post on OKRs, and my views might have changed slightly on it, but yeah, I think the simple way of tying OKRs to the X matrix is your aspirations or your outcomes, your long-term outcomes, your key results, your evidence. OKR says
Yes.
nothing about strategy. Like
Yes.
how are you going to decide what to do to achieve those results, to meet those outcomes?
Yeah,
we
definitely.
do look at OKRs briefly in Foundation. I mean, the way I look at it is OKRs are a way of summarizing the strategy conversation you've already had. You know, as hand down to other people, it's awful. But as a way of summarizing what you're trying to do in the short term,
Yeah.
you know,
So I think I'd
it's
say
good enough. Yeah.
if you're doing OKRs well, you'd have that strategy conversation.
Yes.
But then it's almost like, oh, but the strategy then gets thrown away, and we'll just keep the OKRs and the
Yes.
the
It's
key
like a
results,
fancy
the
version of next
objectives and the key
steps, then,
results.
isn't it?
And then
Yeah.
people are, which I think comes back to the point about doing strategy continuously. And I think that why I kind of talk about strategy deployment, even with something like the X matrix, you can go through the whole process, come up with a set of tactics, and then just kind of go, right, you go off and do this project, do this tactic, and you don't tell them why.
Yep.
And at that point, you're not deploying a strategy anymore, you're just deploying a tactic. Now, you might have done all the best of intentions and done all the right stuff to get to that tactic and engage people. But when people start doing the work, they've now lost sight of back up to the strategy and why they, you know, what challenges we're addressing and what opportunities we're kind of working towards in the first place. Suddenly, they've got no freedom anymore. You have to have that line of sight back to strategy to have freedom.
That's the Dan Pink stuff about providing purpose.
Yeah.
You'll just lose motivation if you don't share that stuff.
Yeah, I agree.
I do find if I then start sort of using flight levels, making sure that messaging going back and up and down the different levels, that does focus them back to always going back to the strategy.
I don't think up and down is enough. You know, I think you've actually got to have, there needs to be some mixing, some participation involved. You know, there needs to be some meetings that involve multiple levels of organization. You know, otherwise you end up with a cascade.
I don't think flight levels precludes having, you know, people from 3 different levels.
No, I'm sure it doesn't. But yeah, I just get slightly nervous about up and down. Top down, bottom up. You know, they both have their problems.
Yeah.
And there's a whole load of problems that you solve very, very quickly if you get people into the room at the same time. It's a remarkable what a difference that can make. You know, at least 3 levels of organization in the room is my rule of thumb for you know, any meeting that really matters in terms of a strategy conversation or feedback. So yeah, I mean, right from, you know, what if we put agreements on outcomes before solutions? That is as much about participation actually as it is about outcomes. I haven't got too much time now, so we're coming up to the top of the hour. But Philippe, you've got a question.
Well, very simple contribution. In my experience, strategy happens between the flight levels, not in the flight levels.
Yeah,
I beg your pardon. You're absolutely right, Philippe.
And that's the idea of working with the strategies. It happens between the spaces, or in my client way, between the scopes and between the scales. Maybe.
Yes. So, those of you who've done the adaptive organization module will recognize that thought. It's a whole chapter of the book that I'm writing. I think the whole thing about what happens between different scales of organization is something that's really poorly understood. And that's something I'm hoping to fix.
Absolutely agree with that.
Yeah, I think you're right.
On that bombshell, perhaps I should give a last word to Karl. Just a bit. So my last word will be: once the video is up on YouTube, I will email everybody with the links that I have, any links that Karl can provide me, PDF of the slides, the events that I mentioned before I hit the record button, and so on. And other than that, thank you very much for attending. Thank you those of you that had comments, questions, and so on, joined in the conversation. Fantastic that you did, and a huge thank you to Karl. As I said before the camera went on, unfortunately, Karl has actually been in on this right from the very beginning. He's been one of my closest collaborators in the development of Agendashift, first of all, and then in leading with outcomes, which is, in a few words, Agendashift as leadership development. I mean, we didn't talk a lot about leadership in Karl's talk today, but I'm sure many of you will realise that there is a lot that how this translates into everyday leadership behaviours and into sort of more longer term things as well. It's not all about facilitating workshops. It's not all about being a coach or a consultant. It's about routines, ways of thinking, principles, and so on. And I want to give credit to Karl for his contribution to all of that. And I will leave the last word with Karl.
Well, thank you for those kind words. I don't think I have anything to add really. If you want to go, if you've got questions or want to follow up on anything, kjscotland@googlemail.com or my blog website Avail Agility. But I think Michael put those details, send those details out. But yeah, look, I enjoyed it. Good conversations. Thank you, everybody.
Good. Thank you all. And I'll be in touch in the next few hours, and if not tonight, then tomorrow.
All right. And Russ, feel free to
Thank you.
send me any feedback. That'd be great.
You want to stay on for 5